Prison show. Oh, oh, oh.
Please help me to welcome Salima. Thank you very much. I think we've had just a wonderful presentation on what human trafficking is. And so what I'm going to do is hit some of the high notes just as a summary and then start focusing on where human trafficking and the legal system meet. First of all, I would be remiss if I did not thank Bukola for the opportunity to be here today. We have, as a result of her hard work, been able to do so many presentations like this to groups big and small, and that has helped us not only advocate for victims, but also identify new victims due to the referral system. One of the things to keep in mind is, while we're getting a lot of information today about human trafficking victims, they are watched all the time because the reason human trafficking is so widespread is that you can sell a human being over and over and over again. And so that one human being is worth so much money to a trafficker. And so it is a prized asset in a way, and they are not going to let that person go easily. So there are very few places that that individual may be able to be seen. Maybe in a grocery store, maybe at a doctor's office, maybe in a church environment, very few places. And we all have to assume that when we see the signs that we talked about today, that Bukola talked about, that we think, you know, something's not right about this person. That we don't approach them in a public place in a way where the person who's watching them may assume that they are giving information, because that can endanger their lives severely. So just like domestic violence, where you have to be careful how you work with victims of domestic violence in a public way, human trafficking is very similar. So when you are engaging with a person like that, not in a probing way, but in a really caring way, you want to do it in a private and protected space. And that's something we should all keep in mind. So we talked about why victims are so valuable. And what is interesting about human trafficking is that while there is no formal study that says exactly how many victims there are, we do know just from the trend data of the victims that have been identified that they are from all over the world, that we have domestic victims and we have international victims, and that they are men, and they are women, and they are children. And children are more complex because it is in our human nature to identify with the adult who appears to be sort of taking care of us. And so, as a result, children sometimes will be the most ardent advocate for the trafficker, saying, that can't be true, they're not taking advantage of me, they really love me, that's why they make me do X, Y, Z. And so it is very, very hard. So there's a whole psychology area just dedicated to youth victims and the amount of care that needs to be given to those victims before they're able to speak, because they really have rationalized the kind of harm they've suffered. And we also see that, I do in my practice, because I practice in the area of immigration law, and a large amount of my practice is dedicated to victims of crime that are international. I also see that similar trend in women, where the men who have brought them here, the alleged traffickers, use marriage as a means to get them into the United States because it is quicker than other ways. Because then that person has legal status to come into the United States, which is something that it is hard to smuggle people in. So they use that as a system. And what ends up happening is that individual wants to believe this is a real marriage, even though all these crazy things are happening. They are being asked to work from sunrise to sunset. They may be asked to sleep with men other than their husband. All kinds of stuff is happening, but it's the rationalization to make it seem like, no, this person could not be betraying me. So that's another whole psychology of area where the mixture of domestic violence in a couple relationship combined with human trafficking is so complex. And so what I'm going to do today is, we can't get into the details of it, but I wanted to give you these tidbits so that in case you're interested, you kind of know that there is a lot more literature in these different areas. So where the legal system intersects with human trafficking, especially internationally, is that some victims come here through valid visas. Now that visas may have been something they have secured because of themselves, like I plan to come and visit the USA. My uncle told me that there is a friend he has in New York who has an apartment and I can go stay there for a week while I visit Central Park and the Statue of Liberty. And I have no idea what's going to happen to me when I get to that apartment. In other words, I'm truly thinking I'm a tourist, and then all this stuff happens. Otherwise, you have people who come here with illegitimate visas. So in other words, they're brought here using the US system, but they are brought here with a visa that is really not what they're going to be doing. So let's imagine somebody brought here as with a student visa, but once they get here, they are not entering a program. They're placed into labor trafficking, where they're working, in restaurants, or they're working in ethnic businesses, or any kind of situation like that. So you've got people coming here legally, and then something happens where they are then put into trafficking. And then there are people who are smuggled into the United States with immigration not knowing anything about them, because they're brought through our porous borders. We have very porous borders. We do want to protect them, and I think we try our best to protect them, but they're porous nonetheless, because we have so many people crossing them at any given time, and the northern border is actually, in my opinion, more porous than the southern one, because we don't expect somebody to canoe through the boundary waters to Minnesota from Canada. We just don't think about things like that. But that's something to keep in mind, is that the borders are porous from both sides. And some people have been moved, not just from their country to here, but through many stops along the way. So their immigration history is very complex. So when we get called, when I get called and say, this person may be a victim of human trafficking, there are two scenarios I'm emotionally prepared for. Either he or she is a victim of sex trafficking, in which case, sometimes it's shocking when you meet someone like that. They don't always fit the profile. So the government's advertisements show a person, like their advertisements show a person sitting in a corner like this. That's kind of what we imagine, right? But if somebody has had to sleep with 60, 70, 80 people a week and survive, they're not going to be sitting in that corner. They have mentally prepared to be a survivor. They may be really tough when you meet them. They may be very, very matter of fact when you meet them. And so part of our challenge is to help them trust us after they've been violated in that way. And so that could be one type of person. The other type of person I could see is a victim of labor trafficking. The most common ones we see are domestic servants. And the reason that area is so complex, or sometimes even people working in a small business setting where they know something is wrong, but they don't know what they can do about it, because the country they come from, there are no labor laws to protect you. So if your boss says you gotta sleep here in the building, wake up at 6 a.m., work till 11 p.m., and then go back and sleep in that place, in their mind, it seems wrong, but they don't know what they can do about it. So labor trafficking is where somebody has taken advantage of a person by making them work, either for no pay or for just absolutely minuscule pay, or they pay you and then they take the money back because they're providing you a cot, and therefore you have to pay for your cot and your food, and you have no freedom of movement, or very limited freedom of movement. And where what is being asked of you to do is above and beyond what is physically humanly possible in a normal day. So you're talking about really extreme situations. People, by the time you see the victim, they may be malnourished, they may have physical health issues. A common one that ends up identifying somebody is dental issues. We don't think about that, but when you've got a bad dental problem, you almost can't do anything else. You have to take care of yourself. And so the trafficker might bring them to a establishment, and then that's where somebody says, something's not right about that person, and in that safe space may identify them as possibly a victim. But all of these types of scenarios is what we can face. So when we meet them, the first thing we have to do is ensure that that we're not causing any more harm. So be very passive to some extent, caring, and not ask too many questions in that first visit, but just to kind of be there and be available and say, I'm just here, whatever you need to say, you can, I'm just here to listen. And it takes often many visits before you actually peel the onion and get the actual story of what's happening. Now at that time, in our country, the Department of Homeland Security is given the responsibility of vetting whether a person is a true victim or not. So the next thing we have to do is bring them to the Immigration Service, which is a very scary thing. And then they're interviewed by an officer who spends most of their time catching bad guys. And so they have to sort of shift gear from I'm here to go catch people to deport them to, and this person is a victim, so I have to now shift gear. And it's a very hard thing. If you think about human nature, you've got a function you do every day, and then every once in a while, your function is exactly the other way. You have to be emotive, you have to be available. It's very hard. So like the last interview I did, the poor officer, they had a box, but they had no Kleenex. Unfortunately, there was a woman talking about a lot of sexual violence that had occurred to her, and they only had 2 men available to interview her. Oh. And the office was so cramped that I could feel her body just get so scared. And then, unfortunately, if you open that office, it's where all the people who are about to face deportation are waiting. Oh. So, it's not the best environment. But this is what we have. We're trying to make do with the resources that the government has. So that they have to go through that interview, and then the government has to make one of 2 decisions. Either they believe you, or they're just not sure. And if they don't believe you, I still have the ability as an attorney to file for that person's possible trafficking visa so that they can remain in the USA, so that we can help them get to a better place than where they are now. Because for many of them, they can't return home because the traffickers know where they live and their families face danger, and there's all kinds of complications. So for many of them, the only option they have is to remain here. And if Homeland Security does not believe them, then we are still allowed to file, but the burden is on us to prove that they're a victim. If Homeland Security does believe them and wants to investigate, they have the ability to give them some legal status right away, and then to support their case to get the visa, in which case the burden is quite a bit lower. So a lot of this depends upon their resources and their willingness to investigate. And a lot of the dance that advocates do with Homeland Security is this dance of, please investigate, this person really needs services, and sometimes they're just not able to. And so we often end up, more often than not, we end up filing without their support and securing approvals by having to present a lot more evidence. Very hard to do when somebody has escaped a situation. They can't go back and get an affidavit from a trafficker that all this really happened. They can't go get pictures of the room that they were in. So we have to use secondary evidence like Google Maps, and we have to use affidavits from people who helped rescue them, and from psychologists and things like that to build the case. And it's a difficult task, but I think the system is getting better, and I think we have more and more officers getting better training on how to shift gear. And it is an unfair thing to ask of them, in all fairness, to have somebody's job be catching illegal people all day, and then they have to also interview and care for human trafficking victims. It's a very different kind of mental outlook. But I think the system is moving in the right direction. And so that is one road that we can take. The other road we can take is that we have something called U visas in the United States. We only have 10,000 of them, but that's for victims of several types of crimes, including human trafficking. Not just human trafficking. It can be, felonious assault. It can be domestic violence. Many, many, many crimes. So sometimes what ends up happening is we are lucky enough that the law enforcement at the local level really believes that this person is a victim, and they're willing to sign off that they are investigating. And if they are willing to investigate, the person may be eligible for this U visa. There's only 10,000 of them, so there's a huge backlog at Homeland Security with all these people who have applied, but they don't have enough slots to approve them, even though they believe all these people, but they just don't have enough slots. But at least that's our backup plan. So the T visa, which is the straight trafficking visa with the support of Homeland Security or not, or the U visa, which is for a whole lot of crimes, are the two big tools we have. However, sometimes you end up with all kinds of other tools like asylum. Somebody who has maybe escaped their country because they fear persecution, that if they return back, something bad would happen. And so they escape from their country, and because they're trying to escape, they're very vulnerable. And so it is an ideal person for somebody who wants to take advantage of someone else to prey on that person because they have no place else to go. And a couple of actually of domestic servitude cases I worked on was because the person was trying to flee their country so badly that somebody offered them a quote-unquote babysitting job or something, and they took it, and then it ended up becoming a labor trafficking situation. Now, how many of you have been following the news with the Indian diplomat? Okay, just let's pretend there's a few of us who don't know about it. Can somebody just get up and just kind of summarize what's going on with that case? Just a very simple, can you just do a quick summary?
So there was a diplomat to the United States from India. And stop me if I'm incorrect.
No, you're right.
And she employed a young Indian woman as a nanny, but she was making her work up to 100 hours a week, is what I read recently. And so somebody leaked this to the Homeland Security, or I'm not quite sure who it got leaked to. They brought her in to be investigated, and as part of the normal investigative process, they did some type of body search on her. Some people say she was strip searched. Well, of course, being a daycare provider for a family in India and working 100 hours a week is not uncommon for the most part. And so the Indian government heard about this and are very upset at the United States. They want the United States to withdraw one of our diplomats from India. In addition to this woman is kind of getting off scot-free. She has to go back to India, but she's getting off scot-free. And I don't think there's any charges being pressed against her, at least nothing that can be upheld in this country.
Not if she's not here.
Right.
Yes.
But was there not also a big issue about the diplomatic immunity of the woman who hired her? And she raised a great big stink about the problem.
And you know what's interesting about that situation is when I read that in the news, I personally have gotten calls from people who have worked, one particular case with a man who worked in an embassy, another case with a man who was, actually another one worked in an embassy, different embassies, where the problem is that when they are here, they are still functioning as an employee of the country that they're from. But we have laws in this country about
child labor laws.
Yeah, we have child labor laws. We have laws about the fact that you have to pay people the minimum wage and all kinds of stuff that doesn't apply to other countries. So then the issue becomes, if people are allowed to bring their entire domestic entourage with them, and then they want to pay them, or there is different than what our laws say, what do we do? And this case, although very high profile because of diplomatic immunity, I'm kind of curious if it started out because somebody thought there was domestic servitude going on because this woman had reported to law enforcement that she was being forced to work all these hours, not getting paid, at least not even the minimum wage, and that's what caused the U.S. prosecutor to want to investigate the crime.
Now, the diplomat has been sent home. Is the woman who was providing the...
And you know, that's not been in the news, but I would think that she would be eligible if law enforcement decided to sign off for either the T or the U visa, if they felt it was extreme trafficking, or if they felt she was a victim of, something less than extreme trafficking than the U visa there were. I would guess that she's probably going to remain. We don't know, but if she goes back, That's the perfect example of somebody who cannot go back.
Yeah.
Because how is she going to protect herself from the very government that thinks she has caused their diplomat to have all this bad publicity? So it's a kind of, so that's the downside of being a whistleblower, is that the road to your own home is cut off to you, and that your family may face lots of danger. And so when we allow a victim to remain in the USA by getting one of these visas, we allow for their immediate family. So if they are a minor, then their parents, siblings. If they are an adult, then their spouse and their children, to be able to join them, because we need to protect them from whatever, wrath comes up because they have spoken up. And communities are very tight-knit, especially within the international communities, very tight-knit. So the word does get out sometimes, and it's very hard for the people who are left back home with no protections, So that's how, that's why those laws are there. Now, when the victims have been here for 3 years, and they have cooperated with law enforcement for whatever law enforcement has needed from them, in some cases their cooperation results in indictments or prosecution of the traffickers. That's the purpose of the visas, is we want them to be secure enough that they can actually be witnesses to the state, so they can get these people off the streets that are committing these crimes. If they spend 3 years in the United States assisting law enforcement or being available to law enforcement, then they are allowed to apply for permanent residence and remain in the USA. And it's many people like that, in my mind, who end up spreading the word about human trafficking because now they're safe enough that they can do it. Whereas if you're always at risk of going back home, you don't know if you can say anything, because while the U.S. laws may protect you, nobody's protecting you back home. And so and that's why we allow it. It's only 5,000 T visas per year that we allow, and we never hit that mark because it's very difficult with this dance with Homeland Security. Or the 10,000 U visas where we hit the mark, and we have an overabundance of people who have applied, because that's for crimes all over the USA where local law enforcement is stepping up and saying, we want to protect this individual. But unfortunately, Congress only has 10,000 visas.
Where does that number come from?
The law, when it was made.
The law.
They said 10,000, they thought, wow, that sounds like a lot.
Right number?
Yeah, but you think about it, how many crimes occur in America? How many local and state law enforcement exist? And and how many victims in that system may be undocumented and afraid to report the crime because they think they're going to get deported? So those people are brave enough to come forward, and law enforcement wants to support them and keep them here so they can testify against the people who have harmed them. But unfortunately, we have a limit on those laws.
Is anyone working on trying to increase that?
They are, and in fact, what Homeland Security has done that's really wonderful is they've said that it doesn't matter if we're only allowed 10,000 visas, we will accept applications from as many law enforcement people as they want to send to us, so that those people can at least remain here and assist law enforcement, because otherwise if we turn down those applications, we didn't even take them in, those people would have nothing. And then how can they fight and show up to court when they're risking deportation every day? It's a scary place to be. So the reason that these laws even came to be is because we wanted law enforcement to have tools to prosecute people. And we wanted these victims to feel safe enough to do so. And that is why those visas exist. So that gives you an overview of kind of how we support human trafficking victims. I think we've hit our time, but I think we're going to have some, can we just do 2 minutes of Q&A? If there's any kind of burning issues about immigration or about how they intersect with this area, I'd be happy to help. Yes.
Were the 10,000 of the visas, is that for the whole country?
Yes, the whole United States and Commonwealths. So that's a lot of law enforcement fighting a lot of important cases, needing to protect a lot of individuals. And this 10,000 is just not enough visas to support all that.
When was that law adopted?
So it was adopted in 2000, but it took till 2007 to come up with the regulations for that. So it's actually been in effect since 2007, but it took a while for people to figure out, okay, Congress has passed this, how are we going to implement it? And that happens. For example, we've had a law on the books since, I'd say, early 2000, that, you know, we get temporary workers to the United States who end up working in these high-tech fields and stuff. Well, when they bring their dependents with them, they're completely dependent on their visa. And when those workers abuse their spouses, those spouses, if they report them, the worker can lose their job and now they're both deported. And if they don't report them, they suffer the violence. So there's a catch-22. And they're not allowed to work in the United States, so they're dependent completely on their abuser, you know? And so Congress passed a law that said, if you have people like that, you should at least give them employment authorization. So during the time their abuser is in the United States, they can work, which would then allow them to support themselves. Maybe they qualify for a different visa, but they're not dependent on the very person who has abused them. Like if they're in a shelter or something like that, at least they can start working. But we don't have regulations for it because it just hasn't yet made it to a priority. So there are lots of laws that are passed that don't end up with regulations very quickly because people haven't figured out how to make them into a reality. It's unfortunate.
Yes. What could we do in contacting our representatives and senators to remedy this? Can you give us
Well, I think that the simple thing to tell them is that if all these law enforcement agencies have identified victims of crimes, there should not be an artificial number of how many can be approved. Because these people have been vetted by law enforcement, who is signing documents to Homeland Security saying, this person is cooperating in a law enforcement effort, we don't want them to be deported. So this artificial 10,000 number doesn't make sense. They should at least lift it and come up with a higher number. But at this point, you know, we have a lot of people. It's about a 15-month wait right now for visas. Not because they're not approvable, because there's no visa numbers for these individuals.
Where do you see, are most of the sex traffickers, do you see them coming from foreign countries for the most part, or not, or is it a mix?
So, you know, I have a 911 operator's view of the world because I only see international cases because I don't work with domestic cases, so I only see that part.
Okay.
But, you know, there are organizations like Breaking Free and many others who work with domestic victims, and I'm sure they could tell you stories. Some of the trainings I've been with them have been some of the most powerful for me as an individual, to know that the entry age for grooming a young girl into sex trafficking is age 12. You know, and so it's alive and well in this country, and unfortunately, people from this country and people from other countries are benefiting from the international sex trade. Any other questions? Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I was using a presentation made by Homeland Security. So,
okay.
yes, I have my cards. I'll leave them actually up here if anybody has questions.